Good afternoon, and thanks again for persevering and being with us up until now. Let me eliminate the last part of the first quiz that was suggested by our moderator by thanking him as being also the second of his students, and I'm very honored to be here today, addressing also a special thank you to the regulatory authority for inviting Intel to share some of our opinions. Unfortunately, for those of you that stayed up until 6 o'clock in the afternoon to see the exact recipe of the 2020 network, I'm sorry, our crystal ball is a little clouded, so I don't have the exact recipe. Also, being a core technology provider, we unfortunately do not have specific products or recipes as the esteemed colleagues from the technology equipment manufacturers that spoke before of me. In exchange for that, I would like to share with you some of the views we gather, first of all, by interfacing with them, but second, by interfacing with the carriers. I've been following this session since today, and there's a good piece of news for you. Lots of my material have been presented before, so I'll be able to quiz through it very quickly and focus on the key points. But let's get on by saying that, obviously, everybody seems to agree that the successful network is an upward spiral if all of these components work well. And this is, as we would say, an act for more actors. You know, if all of these components work correctly, eventually we end to all of these beautiful things, you know, the heaven that is called customer satisfaction, revenue per user, successful business models, pervasive networks, successful new usage models, etc. As a contrast to what you would expect from an Intel presentation, I will most probably focus today on the core network as opposed to the client devices, so there may be some small surprises in there, and try to focus on one of the constraints we see talking to both carriers, operators, but equipment manufacturers, and what we would propose would be the overall architecture for such a network in order to be able to sustain the demands that will be imposed on it in the near future. Let's start from some of the challenges. Most of them will look very familiar to you. First of all, the device growth is explosive, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on that. And do not really think about TVs or mobile units, but start thinking out of the box about devices that today are not even addressing telecom or other networks, and in 5 years' time will demand to be serviced by these future networks. Of course, the usage trend is more bandwidth and demanding applications, and actually the Internet Innovation Association calls this the exaflood, which is actually much more of a flood than you only say. And in principle, we start getting more educated or more tech-savvy users. Once upon a time, a line or a phone giving a tone signal was very okay for any consumer. Today, our consumers start talking about security, about content management, and most of all, the classic and very, very favorable term of all engineers in the 90s and even at the beginning of this century, quality of service, is now replaced by the more marketeering but more accurate term of quality of experience. So everything is actually measured by how satisfied the consumer is, which is the direct relevance on the amount of dollars, euros, or whatever currency he's willing to share with us in this process. The network slowdown is obvious, and it has been obvious even before the crisis that has hit the markets recently. It has been accelerated by this down, and this actually leads to the fact that the classic business models and all of the decisions, financing, regulation that derive from them pretty much crumbles down and needs to be redesigned from scratch. Last but not least, for most of the companies that we operate in this segment, not only the connected device growth is a very important element to be considered, but also what would be the strategy to make this work for us instead penalizing us. I would like to elaborate for a few seconds, first of all, on the concept of quality experience. I would say that this is a little bit internal for us, but let's share the recipe of how a successful service or how successful an experience is based on. Of course, the network is a key component. Of course, the service, it's what it's all about. The device, as most of us know, reaching in our pocket or in our computer or in every device that is supposed to consume these new generation services. Design, trend, and performance are, of course, key indicators. The service should be anything from unrestricted, personalized, trusted, secure, but also the connectivity should be ubiquitous, pervasive, robust, and pretty much unobstructed, even in the most adverse and innovative circumstances. Moving back to the connected devices, we're really talking, ladies and gentlemen, about an iceberg picture, because if some of us are in awe by the number of new desktop computers, notebook, netbooks, or whatever books, smartphones were mentioned today, start thinking about healthcare, start thinking about industrial automation, start thinking about monitoring, start thinking about all of these applications that today are a totally different silo, most probably in the 19th century electric world, that will demand in the near future to be serviced by these new generation networks, and which pretty much generate a very sharp picture as the one that is being described in here, that shows that maybe the number of clients or devices that will demand to be serviced by our networks will just grow by a factor of 3.5, but the total volume of data that will be generated by these devices will increase by 350x. It has been very acutely presented by my colleague that, of course, the population of the planet will not grow to 50 billion, but undoubtedly the number of devices that will need the underlying network will definitely grow or even breach these quite optimistic numbers. And let's think about this classic American concept, follow the money, okay? As per a review that has been done by a very esteemed carrier, T-Mobile, we find out that most of these services, as they are in the current business model, do not necessarily yield revenue for most of the service providers, which, put it bluntly, most of the service providers, if they had to stick with the same business model as they were